My name is Gibberd, and I'm one of the coordinators that has organized this competition. And I'm the coordinator of W116, which is Smart and Sustainable Built Environments at the CIB. And what we're going to do this afternoon is have one of the series of workshops, of presentations leading into the competition. And the idea very much is just to present ideas, thinking, and to allow students, tutors to ask questions and have a bit of a discussion. It's very important for this competition that we think differently. We think of new ideas, we think of different methodologies, and that's why we have a lot of time at the end for discussion. So please, as we go through the presentations, make notes. We've got some very interesting speakers through the different workshops, and it's always quite fun at the end to get some good questions and discussion. So this afternoon, what we are going to do is cover environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability. I'm going to do a presentation on environmental sustainability. We have Gita, who I'll introduce briefly, and then she'll say a little bit more about herself and ideas. And then we'll have Francine from Tonder at the end covering economic sustainability. So the broad structure is that we have about 15 to 20 minutes each. We'll just run them back to back and then have hopefully some good discussions at the end. So that's the structure, and I'm now going to get going. So what I'm going to cover is really thinking about new ways of thinking. One of the kind of key issues that we want to stimulate with this competition is looking at some of the existing problems differently and coming up with some new ideas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ideas we think with and ideas we think of, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about are really not prescriptive technologies or approaches, but really methodologies and ideas you can think with to develop more sustainable designs. Towards the end, I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the criteria. There are many criteria around for environmental sustainability, social sustainability, etc. And they're good as checklists, but not necessarily as a generating stimulus of how you think about sustainability. And then really at the end, just talk fairly quickly about a methodology, a loose framework that you can use. So let's start. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this quote: "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we use to create them." We are in a situation where we have built our cities, all of our buildings, to create an extremely unsustainable society, infrastructure, communities. And if we carry on, we're going to perpetuate all the problems we have, perpetuate climate change problems, flooding, all sorts of disasters that we're now experiencing. So what's the new thinking? What's the new approach? And it's quite useful to think about this and just look at some very simple examples. So a lot of you hopefully at some point rode a bicycle or still ride bicycles, hopefully. And it's a very good illustration of two sets of ideas. When we ride bicycles now, once you're experienced in riding bicycles, you get on the bike and you think of where you're going. You just get on the bike and automatically a lot of your thinking kicks in. You pedal the right way, you balance, you turn the handlebars, and you end up in the place that you need to be. So that's an idea we think of. It's kind of the end result. However, towards that, in building up that end result, we actually forget a lot of the unconscious thinking, a lot of the processes that enable us to do that. And if you look at this small boy here learning to cycle, what he's doing is he's learning those first principles about steering into the way that you're about to fall so that you balance. And what is very interesting is to start thinking about what are the ideas that you use to design. And so the second example I'm going to show you really on the right is someone called Graham Aubrey, who's quite an interesting character from Scotland. And what he did was he started rethinking cycling. And he used all sorts of things like washing machine bearings. He did a lot of training by himself. It was a one-man band, really, and started thinking kind of re-engineering how bicycles can be designed. And what's interesting is that he won a number of land speed records, world records in terms of speed, in terms of aerodynamics, new postures, and new mechanics. And all of this were kind of just through rethinking some of the basic principles of how bicycles work. And he beat some of the very established Lotus design bicycles and some of the Olympic sports people. And I think what is interesting here is to use this competition really as an opportunity to go back to some first principles and really rethink that, in terms of sustainability, about what it really is and how we make it work and how you achieve very high performance. So the first set of ideas is to think about kind of capabilities of the site. A site has lots of capabilities. There's climate, there's rainfall on it. So this particular image is from Gaborone, where they did a study on rainwater harvesting for the whole city and looked at how the whole city could use rainwater harvesting to become more independent and resilient for water. The next one, some of you may have come across this, are websites that you can use to calculate solar capabilities. So you can identify a site, you can use some tools on that site, and you can allow that to generate the solar capability, so how much power that site can generate over time for different roof arrangements, etc. All of this information you can do for South Africa on the site if you're interested. We need to understand what's happening around the site. So what are the capabilities inherent in terms of the spatial arrangements? The kind of footprint, the rather ghostly footprint on the left is a study I did of informal trade in Pretoria. And it's very interesting to see what the greatest concentrations of informal trade are. So this is the railway station, Church Street, coming through here, Church Square, Marabastad here, and people who do informal trade know very well where to get the best trade. And so there's kind of particular patterns of movement and trade that work. And the second slide here really just shows a very detailed audit of informal enterprises in an informal settlement, and how it's incredibly complex, and there's all these layers that work together in terms of different businesses and trade and relationships. And again, one of the things you want to do is look at how that works around the site, and ideally work with the capabilities that already exist and build on those and focus them so that you generate better and more sustainable activities on site. A lot of you probably have started using computers for modeling and hopefully experimenting with a lot of the software that's now very freely available and very powerful. If some of you have used some of the AI tools, you'll know it's amazing what happens. Just the speed at which things are changing. But the really important thing is to use it intelligently. One of the things that is important is that you need to feed in the right criteria. You need to feed in the right parameters. So this particular example shows a particular methodology to optimize daylighting and energy for a particular building form and envelope, and very quickly, and such. So very quickly, what you can do is you can put in the main parameters of the site, and then you can run many different building forms, many different building envelopes, fenestration, shading devices, to then get the optimum balance of those different parameters. And again, that's very much what we're going to be trying to do, is to say, what's the methodology to try and make sure that you get all of the different key objectives that you want to achieve optimized and working together on the site. What's also very interesting is how you can start using some of the existing patterns and capabilities of a site to generate form. And this particular example is an example of a new university, Park Bit in Mallorca. And they use the topography, access to daylight, access to sunlight, water flows, air flows, to really generate an optimal form that works very, very well with the local climate, with the local topography. So again, you can use sites to help generate optimal forms, just like you have ecosystems where an organism fits and evolves with the site. You can do the same thing with built environment form. We also need to think about time. So what happens to the site over 24 hours, over a week? What happens at weekends? What happens over a year? So this particular example just shows a very simple illustration of that, is that if we think about a site where there's very heavy downpour, some roof types will generate very huge outflows, and all that water goes straight into the stormwater sewage. You get very high outflows, and you may get flooding. There's a big problem in many of our urban areas with that particular solution. If you think through different solutions like turf roofs, rainwater harvesting, retention ponds, you can change that profile totally so that you get far slower outflows, you store a lot more water on site, and you're seeing the site as really kind of dynamic, changing entity which you can control and you can regulate to suit what you want to achieve. Another way is to forget plans and sections and start experimenting with different representations. So a very easy one is some of the kind of ecosystem generation diagrams that you can use. So this particular one shows water, so getting mains water, it's used indoors, it's used outdoors, it's used for drinking, toilets, bathing, laundry, and then it goes straight out into the sewage systems, or it goes out into groundwater. Now, once you've got a diagram like this, you can start thinking about what are the opportunities and where your inputs are. So in this particular case, you might want to get inputs from the rain. You might want to look at the qualities of water flowing through the system in terms of grey water, black water, and then look at how you can have loops that take some of the higher quality water back into the system and reuse it. So in the end, you get far more efficient, low input and low output, low waste systems. Another important idea is to kind of think about the life of the building over time. with COVID, most of our office buildings are empty. And there's a huge growth in conversions where a lot of them are being changed to residential buildings, and some can't be because they're poorly designed. Strategically, the floor-to-ceiling house don't work, services don't work, things like a vertical circulation don't work. So one of the really important things if you want a sustainable building is to imagine and envisage change in that building over 10, 15, 20, 25 years, but also what may change around that site. So is it going to be a hub for other activities, and how might that influence your building? So don't think of your building just as a linear single-use element, but how it could change and how it could accommodate different activities and change. So the circular economy is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but it's a very interesting idea, and there's lots of potential, I think, if you're looking at sustainable buildings. So this particular project I presented at the World Circular Economy Forum, and it's a model that looks at how you can break up a building into a structural component. You can have very flexible, adaptable, bio-based panels and systems, so you can have many different residential types. You can have commercial, social infrastructure at the bottom on the first floor. You can provide access so that you can maintain the building very easily. You can repair components. You can tailor it for the climate. And then you use different areas productively. So you'd use the roof for renewable energy, for roof gardens, and basically have a very flexible, adaptable system that works very well in terms of providing all the services and needs of its occupants, but also stimulating circular activities like food systems, repair, maintenance systems, mobility systems around the building as well. This is a picture by Johnny Miller. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these pictures, and they're usually the ones that create the most discussion, because on one side you may have a very small track that might be 30, 40 square meters with 4 people in it. On the other side, you might have a house that's 200, 300, 400 square meters with 2 people in it. And we need to kind of think, remove ourselves a little bit from the emotional unfairness of it, and really kind of think about sustainability. So if you look at global targets, it's very clear that we have to have levels of sufficiency. We need to have particular parameters which are fair and equitable in terms of the amount of space that people use, in terms of the amount of resources, in terms of the ecological footprints that individuals and households can have. So one of the things you need to kind of tackle is this fairly difficult issue in terms of kind of thinking what those parameters are, and equate them and link them up with the global elements. So final set of slides coming through are really to think about kind of living and working patterns. Ultimately, what your building is trying to do is support, enable, encourage, force maybe even people to have more sustainable living and working patterns. So this particular example is a bed set in the UK, and because they provided particular sets of facilities, technologies, organizational requirements, there's a community forum, etc. Gita, I think, is going to talk about some of these things that actually make a huge difference. It's been able to have a fraction of the impact that other similar housing types achieve. So it's about stimulating new ways of living and working. So I talked about criteria at the beginning. That many of you will be aware of things like Green Star, LEED, EDGE, etc. Some of you may have come across things like BEST or SBAT or WELL. So use the frameworks, use the criteria as checklists, but also to go in and kind of look at the quantitative objective exercises that are used to show that you've achieved a particular level of performance. So it's about the rigor in the methodologies as well as the criteria. So just to finish off on, what is important here is kind of think about your analysis. What does this say about your kind of key objectives, your priorities? And then once you've defined your key priorities and objectives, how are you going to generate your form? How are you going to generate your building? And what are the kind of very rigorous evolution or the optimization and selection of options that really will give you the highest performance. One of the really important things is not just to say this is a sustainable building or a green building, but is for you to show and demonstrate that is the case. And there are lots of tools that you can use. And when you talk about net zero, you must follow the technical terminology, the definitions, and you can use a lot of the software. You can develop your own Excel spreadsheets, do the calculations, and really kind of demonstrate what you're trying to achieve, whether it's energy, it's jobs, it's food, it's the local economy. Do it rigorously, use methodologies that are available, and not just show the design, show that it actually works and it's the right approach. Good, I think my time is up. Just to let you know that I've written what I've just presented up as a short article, which is on jeremygibberd.com. So we've got a few more resources, not many more, but it also just kind of helps remind what I've just covered now. So I think that's it from me. I want to make sure there's enough time for everybody else, and we can go back to questions at the end. Good. Okay. Can I just check? Gita, you more or less ready?
Yes, Jeremy, I'm ready. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and then if you can share. Okay, thank you. I've known Gita for many years, really one of the pioneers of sustainability, sustainable architecture in South Africa, and has done some very interesting projects, particularly around the social issues. So I think I'm going to take up her time and let her talk her stuff. Thank you very much, Gita, for making time.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and hello, everyone. So this looks like a really interesting project, and so I'm just going to share some perspectives on social sustainability. I'm having difficulty advancing my slides. Anybody?
Click the arrow buttons on the bottom.
Yeah, it's not. It's oh, there we go. There we go. Hang on. Perfect. I got it. Okay, so in looking at your brief, the objective was to create a community, and I just recapped some of the kind of words that were used there, and your submissions are going to require mainly a focus on the built environment from what I could see. So in terms of the perspectives on social sustainability, it's important to understand the context that we are dealing with, and then also the opportunity that this particular project presents. So in terms of the context, we on the African continent are facing the fastest pace of urbanization that is still happening as we speak. In South Africa, however, we have had a fairly rapid pace of urbanization post-1994, But what that has resulted in is a marginalization of new arrivals into the city, so that people live in the peripheries, they live in decaying areas, etc., etc. The backlog is huge and is likely to continue. We also are recipients of a large number of economic and social refugees from Africa and many other parts as well. So what does this project present as an opportunity? And I think it's a wider question for almost cities anywhere, that cities provide opportunities for housing by enabling access to economic opportunities, social infrastructure, and public transport. The question we have to ask is, who are the people who find these spaces? Their families, their children, their women, their breadwinners, individuals, economic commuters, cyclical economic migrants, refugees. And the question is, what is a vision for their futures? What are their dreams and aspirations? What are their needs? And how do we support social development, given that sustainability is very difficult in terms of the low government inputs that can be provided. And as we speak, the government budgets are being challenged more and more. What are the building blocks from this place context connecting to its wider place and possibilities for emergent community building? What I mean by that is that a place doesn't exist in itself. It can become a supporting environment to its wider hinterland, as the wider hinterland becomes a supporting environment to the people in that place. So what is our role as architects and spatial design intermediaries? So we have to look at the interventions that support healthy lifestyles, particularly livelihoods, and places that allow people to live, learn, play, eat, and commune at an everyday basis, that support safety, security, sense of community, social networks, livelihood, and jobs, essentially rebuilding the community glue. Typically, the lifespans of people arriving into new neighborhoods might have social networks that come from existing areas, but they are also about remaking of those social networks. So who are the actors and drivers that can make social and urban regenerative development happen? And here we are talking about urban regeneration and social regeneration. So these are some thought provocations. Do the current residents have authorized access to the goods and rights of the city? I think underlying a lot of assumptions we make is this idea that people are there, we have to deal with them. But I think there are policies, programs, and other activities at hand that may either thwart this or support this. Who does have authorized access and who does not? And is there a difference in the way in which they can inhabit and access the goods and rights of the city? Who are the key drivers, role players, and stakeholders in this endeavor to recreate and reimagine this urban environment? Why and what can they do? And what is in it for them? How are resources mobilized internally, externally, and vertically? How is agency of community building action mobilized? How is funding accessed? What are the interventions and what are the possible outcomes? So those are some questions that we need to deal with. So in doing a scan of different ways in which some of these things have been addressed, I looked at this particular report put together by the World Bank, because this is a vexed problem that exists in many third world cities, but in almost all cities anyway. And what they've done is identified a sequence of actions that are needed for a regeneration process. And there are 4 distinct phases. And I suspect that your project timeframe didn't allow for those phases, but you might have touched on some of those. That involves scoping, planning, financing, and implementation. And you may well ask, and where does design fit into all of this? And we'll come to that. They're unique tools that local governments can use to systematically design a regeneration process. So we have to design the actual process itself before we can get to the design of the actual environment. In addition to the 4 phases, the 3 major assets that the city can use for urban regeneration include the land and the things that go with the land and the different land uses, the community, and that community might already be partly resident on that site, but it might be the anticipated community that you expect to arrive there. And that has a relationship to what it is that you imagine is going to go onto the site, and the environment. And by the environment, we mean the built environment, the residential, social, green, and the supporting city and surrounding hinterland, and the relationships to that hinterland. And affordable transport routes and access is key to all of this, because at the end of the day, the degree of access we have, mobility we have, access to connectivity that we have, can make the difference between what you can get access to and you don't. And there are tools for generating and managing each asset. Most importantly, something of this nature can only come together more and more so if the public sector, the private sector, finance, and the champions, including the champions externally and in the communities, work together. So how do we understand that? So every city has pockets of underused and underutilized land and decaying decaying urban areas. And there are various reasons why this comes about. Now, government itself can provide the impetus and some resources for regenerating urban land, which successfully uses their land assets and regulatory powers to leverage and incentivize private participation in urban regeneration. So it's important to understand what land belongs to whom, and what decisions can be made, and what assumptions can be made around what land uses could be visualized for the future. There is definitely a need for financial resources, sometimes massive, but sometimes you can substitute some of those financial resources through other strategies, but you will ultimately need money. The community and business sector participation is very important to ensure the sustainability of the regeneration efforts. And this can be at a very low level of understanding the informal sector trading, and more the informal sector trading for the everyday goods and needs of people in an environment can add up to a decent amount of livelihood and income generation for some people. Private sector participation is a factor in success of regeneration of underutilized urban land. And the United Nations report that I was referring to has got a document that looks at interventions in 8 different cities, and I would encourage you to look at those. And in particular, it looks at the work that was done in Johannesburg in the urban city blocks in regenerating them. Each of those cities has dealt with different aspects, but I think a common theme in a lot of these things is that invariably when built environment interventions occur, often the poorest of the poor are knocked out of that equation. And that is unfortunate. And the question that we need to hold close and dear is, can this work be done without really bumping out the lowest end of the rung? These are some diagrams that come from the work of the previous slides, and the World Bank link is there. And I thought that it was quite useful to just look at the tools for urban regeneration. We need to understand what the underlying social and development impetus is, who the development agents are, community champions, city policy, and the approach to address urban and social regeneration. Sometimes it's a coalition of university-initiated initiatives together with social movements that work together. And what is facilitating versus what is policing or repressing the kind of natural surge of activity that people generate anyway in their efforts to survive and thrive in these environments. So the tools for urban regeneration look at scoping, planning, financing, and implementation. And the diagram kind of spells out the different aspects that could be looked at. Now, within the first 2 steps of scoping and planning are also located the opportunities for intervention into the built environment. And then the remainder are what support the making and the realization of how we think some of those things work. From our list of work that we've done in different places, we also, I've just tabulated that list, that to create safe and inspiring places to live, learn, work, play, eat, and commune, maybe we need to embrace this idea of sleeping small and living big, so that the social and services infrastructure almost becomes more dominant and important. And the opportunity to create beautiful and inspiring spaces can make a huge difference to the sense of well-being of people. Understanding the housing ladders, and I have a different slide that I'll talk to just now, so that the notion of sleeping small and living big can be supported. Looking at skills and job ladders, including reaching from where people are into the hinterland, the city hinterland, and further. The affordable and safe transport systems and mobility and what they give access to, what the internal social bylaws are that exist and can be created in order to create safer spaces to operate within, the notion of skills, assets, and services mapping, and the visual demonstration of that mapping, so people can rapidly become, can learn to read their environment and operate within it, and to identify gaps in terms of connecting, targeting, strategizing, and delivering, facilitating and servicing modes of production and economic activity, and facilitating apps and the utilization of digital technology to access credit, info, and business support. A friend of mine works in one of the slums in Nairobi, and he has just launched an app that gives people access to microcredit. And as they access the microcredit and put the money into the different pockets that they do using the IPESA system, they then get tools to learn how to regenerate their business, but also create savings so that they can grow their business over time. Now, separately, I just want to note another opportunity that we need to think about, and that is that solving the problems of the city just inside the city is not going to be enough, because virtually every city we look at, especially major cities, are becoming so congested and are becoming such accretions that the infrastructure often is failing and is groaning under the weight of all that added urbanization that has happened. So a separate lot of work that I do is looking at new city making. And I'm referring to this because the diagram on the left, which is called the Community Growth 6-Pillar Approach, and the book that we've published, which is called 2 Billion Strong, which is downloadable for free, shares some thinking around the fact that when we understand how to stimulate the economy, all the other things become a lot easier, like access to housing, education, healthcare, governance, and regenerative systems design. Most importantly, governance and regenerative systems design are key to how we understand all of these things work. And there's a lot of work going around the environmental and social governance, the ESG space, that you need to familiarize yourself with, through which funding can also be accessed to stimulate some of these projects that we are working on. Again, looking at work we've done in different places. On the left, you see a matrix that has summarized the way in which we've looked at the notion of regenerating Dunoon, which was designed in 1994 at the dawn of our new democracy as a low-income settlement with starter housing. 3,500 sites were delivered with starter units, and very rapidly it grew into 15,000 households living in that community. And so what we've looked at is the recovery of public sites, urban infrastructure and services upgrade, supporting residential upgrades through overlay zones and zoning of that site so that we can estimate the kind of densities and interventions that could be possible, to develop the key precincts so that, again, we bring the urban design thinking into creating the precincts that hold the right things that are of value to this particular community. At the center of the whole thing is the economic linkages and the targeting of jobs and how people can live small in this environment and be able to sleep small but live big in terms of all of the things they need in their lives. We targeted specific facilities, particularly education facilities, etc. We looked at community and vocational programs, so the programmatic aspect that would inhabit some of those facilities, the sustainable resource management of the resource assets in that community, and also around particularly addressing the opportunity for food production and waste recycling and the recovery of nutrients. We also worked with that community around crime and safety mapping so that they could really become more familiar with how to be safe in their environment. And then the strategic approaches, which then went into the reports, and then the outputs, which are the most important thing, because it's through those outputs, and that's what you've been asked to look at through the built environment interventions, is how they ultimately support functional public spaces, public facilities, jobs and economic opportunities, health and safety, open green spaces, private property upgrade. And then we locked that into the IDP cycles of the City of Cape Town, and we gave them guidelines for how they could progressively realize this over a number of different cycles of investment, because typically our governments cannot do those investments all in one go. So in terms of what we looked at, and these are all diagrams generated from our reports, the pathways for development starts with economic and employment programs, private land uses, public open spaces, facilities, movement systems, infrastructure and service capacity, and then the planning, land use rights, housing, household net densities. Again, our infrastructure is planned for a particular density. Typically, the densities far outnumber our planning, often by 3 to 5 times the numbers in the population density, and therefore we need to almost over-design our infrastructure. Then we talk about the actual ladders. We talk about how ladders are conceived of from unskilled activity and employment through to advancing skills, and the kinds of activity that could support that. We look at the actual incoming community from unskilled farm workers through to specialized organic producers. So that's a different trajectory of ladders. And then we also look at domestic workers through to upskilling them to a level of household managers. And again, there are partners in the wider environment that can support much of this activity. These tracks can begin to service its wider environment in very practical ways, which just acknowledges the ways in which our societies work. Quite a lot of these ladders can be supported by our EPWP programs, which are a national program, and they can start off as multipliers, starting with livelihoods, where one EPWP program can be split into a 24-hour cycle of work. And these are some diagrams that shows how you target the notion of training of trainers, and then a level of certification so that people can begin to advance in the way in which they start and how they can continue. Now, underpinning some of those strategies was looking closely through spot surveys that we did in the community, where we trained the community to do the surveys. And what we found was how people spent their household incomes. And these were just some average figures. They are quite old now, but they represent very alarming statistics in what we see there. Of 2,400 odd rand, the rent is about 500, the transport is about 300, and the food is about 600. The other spend, a lot of it is used for mental and physical well-being and other mishaps. And it leaves very little for people to be able to live. And yet in this environment, people are paying 88 rand a square meter for access to accommodation. So an entire family might live in 9 square meters of accommodation. And they do that because it gives them access to a lot of work in that environment. One of the key issues that people face, especially women and children, is the kind of safety and crime. And again, we mapped that with the community, and we taught them how to represent that in their community centers, so that the different areas of mapping gets them to understand that even in a pocket like this of 3,500 households, each neighborhood and precinct actually experiences a different type of crime and violence. And the community can actually be trained to gear themselves up to combat that through community policing activities. And again, the space where this can happen, how they are supported to this mapping, how they are equipped to deal with this is all things that can be looked at. And it's a combination of the programs, the built environment, and the activities, the engagement with that community that can make the difference. On a different project where we had a brownfield site, we framed the project, it's called Busin Chunsha in the Philippi area, as an integrated project. And this was now looking where the government wanted to create a catalytic development program. And we said we looked at the policy considerations and we looked at the objectives that could really stretch all the investments as far as possible. So we looked at the housing instruments, the livelihood strategies, the governance, and the procurement. And against each one, we identified the key objectives. So with housing, we wanted to optimize the CapEx. We said for each government-related unit, we know that it can offer rental accommodation and it can offer an opportunity for work activity. With the livelihood strategies, that helps to support the OPEX. In this instance, we put solar roof array on all of the roofs. That became a complete solar farm. And that solar farm allowed people in 4-story housing to be able to pay their rates and taxes. They became investors in that actual solar program. And underneath the solar panels, we had targeted food production. And again, in the Joburg example, in that UN report, you'll see that there's quite a lot of rooftop food production that happens. That was not for feeding the communities, but it was providing microgreens and fancy stuff for the expensive restaurants in the city and for export quality. These are real projects that we've tested with people on the ground and with businesses that support the solar and the green stuff. So we've got to be able to span the economic kind of sector and make those sensible decisions. With governance, we looked very much at transitioning behavior, particularly utilizing the cell phones and the apps. And we looked at how over time, each precinct can have local management, and that over a 5 to 10 year period, they really become able to manage their environment. And the use of the social and other bylaws allows them to look at that. And then the procurement looks at the concurrent delivery of buildings, facilities, businesses, services, management, as well as the education program. This is the wider map of the challenges and how we thought about it. So we know that land is a premium. We said that instead of 4 RDP houses in a row, if we stack them up and we ran the financial models through all the way up to national government, and what we showed was that what you save on this is substantial, but how you procure it makes the difference. And what that does is it allows each household then to be able to have rentable space, so that not only do they have their RDP house, but they also become able to rent accommodation to the people who are non-qualifiers, the people who don't have access to the goods and rights of the city, can then rent for an affordable level and be integrated into that society. We looked at the family budgets. I shared that slide with you earlier. And we looked at the management and the asset value. In terms of the livelihood strategies that are pertinent to this environment itself, we looked at the rental incomes, the rooftop farming, the rooftop PV, creating agri-hubs where there were existing buildings so that the surrounding farms could use this as a local market. We looked at water resilience. We sit on an aquifer. So like the slide that Jeremy showed about water, we showed that the water budget that they use could stretch much further and have 3 cycles of use. We looked at recovering all the organic nutrients from the waste cycle, and about up to 60% of waste generated in a settlement like this is organic, and they could compost it on site, throw it into the ESCOM servitude and grow vegetables, and thereby actually support their local community. We looked at local goods and services, etc. And we targeted the kind of income mix and the kinds of apartments and policy instruments that could support the mixed uses of the kind of housing so that we avoided creating dormitories. I wasn't completely happy with that mix, but that was what the policy would allow at that stage. We then applied urban design principles in the design of this environment, so that we designed gateways, we put the primary and high school at a very urban level with shared fields and facilities. We created ECDs and meeting public squares where all the organics could be recovered, where the playground equipment, etc., could be located. The corners of each citadel, each little precinct, is a citadel that has 4-story around it and 3-story in the middle. Everything carries a roof array, and this became a computational metrics for the number of households, for the number of rental spaces, for the amount of PV solar that we could generate, the amount of food that could be produced. The ESCOM servitude is at the top, and it also is computed in terms of the level of water and organic nutrients it could hold and how much vegetables it could generate. And all of this added up to both creating beautiful spaces, and the precinct on the left, which has the red stripes in it, was the utilization of existing buildings in order to create a local market and supply industry and processing industry of the produce produced south of this, which is the Philippi horticultural area. At the heart of this was the school, the primary and the high school, because one of the biggest aspects of losing our youth is the transition from primary school to high school. And what we learned through our work with 2 Billion Strong and Community Grow is that when those schools actually create a holding for those young people, where they have a custody of care moving from early childcare to primary school to high school, they don't have the opportunity to fall into the drugs and the gang kind of cycle that becomes very prevalent in these kind of environments. So long stories to tell, but this is how we use the spatial dimension to also show what could be possible. And then inside each neighborhood, we took a lot of care to create pedestrian play spaces, to create vehicular circulation, to create a central meeting hub, and to create small urban squares. And the red buildings are the buildings that are mixed use. They're zoned in that way, but they rely on the private sector, and that they give different access to maybe gap housing, people who can invest in creating the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, etc. So we're utilizing both the public and the private investments in order to create that. We then also showed that the way in which people can afford to live in this environment is where they can maybe rent a bed, and this comes from Medulla Moho's work. Medulla Moho operates in Johannesburg as well as in many centers, and they also have got fantastic training programs. And what they showed is that what people can afford in terms of renting a bed, to renting shared rooms, to shared communal facilities or self-contained units or sectional title, come at different price tags. So your environment can be informed by this in terms of what is 1, 2, 3, 4-story, and also how the government investment can support some of these additional modes of creating additional income and access. At the heart of it, I think every urban regeneration project seeks to restore to the city a sense of greatness. So this was a caption that we tried to inspire everybody with, which was to say that great places and great cities are made when 3 things come together, acting as magnets for the people who are inside, but also who the people outside, and that it becomes attractive for investment at many levels, from informal trading through to formal businesses, and that all people respond to inspiring places and inspiring leaders in their community, that communities are built by investing in human capabilities, where those facilities can support the growth of those human capabilities through caring connections, self-actualization, etc., and that development is stimulated and led by investing in public places and spaces. A few other references I want to share with you. FabHab in Medellin, and you might have come across this. And if you Google and there's the link, you'll see that they've invested in key interventions in what they would call acupuncture points. And they've won many awards and accolades. The work of Arrival Cities by Doug Saunders, again, it's been around for a while, shows that in new places where arrival cities, and in a way your site is an arrival precinct, can begin to, where you create open and public and inspiring architecture, you actually help to shift tendencies towards more positive modes of social behavior and interaction. And in environments like this, women become very big champions because they are the guardians of the social values of houses, of the homes, their networks, and the communities. And often the kind of more dominant patriarchal tendencies towards more conservative behavior can actually be nudged towards more positive behaviors. And again, if you look at the work about arrival cities, and this is a paper and a whole series of resources, shows that while the city is still marked by residential segregation, ethnic inequality, greater generational diversity, and a super diversity of new migrant flows have substantially altered the experiences and complexity of migration and settlement in the city, producing new forms of community building, flourishing ethnic minority economies, and complex urban geographies of local identity, differential inclusion, and encounter. There's a project called Public Benches. If you Google it, you'll see again, it offers the opportunity to seed conversations in communities that actually encourage people to engage. And then, of course, if you don't refer to Jane Jacobs and the work around the death and life of great American cities, which in the 60s already preempted this idea that cities will go through cycles of generation and regeneration. And there's a wealth of resources there as well. We've got to rethink urban inclusion, and this is a body of work, again, which comes from various manuals that talks about the notion of urban inclusion, and we have to be very careful that our work doesn't add to urban exclusion through the way in which investments are made, and I'll leave you to look at that in greater detail. And lastly, after COVID, there has been a host of very, very interesting discussions, and I found some of the Indian discussions very valuable. There's a webinar happening this Saturday by the Baha'i Institute, and this is the link for it. You can register. And I think it's trying to drill down more deeply into how we build a more caring world, where after the family, it is the community, which consists of people living in geographic proximity to each other, that provides the most natural setting for building relationships and networks of care. After all said and done, it's those networks of care that have allowed us to be able to climb out of COVID. So with that, I'm going to leave you with those thought provocations and wish you well with your projects. And thank you very much for just allowing me to share some of that thinking and those thoughts. I would encourage you to use some of those links. Please feel free to download my book called 2 Billion Strong, and please copy and use whatever is valuable. If we keep our ideas to ourselves, they don't see the light of day and they don't help to make the difference. So, and feel free to reach out and be in communication if you'd like access to anything further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gita. Lots of ideas, lots of things to think about. Just to let everybody know, something I mentioned at the beginning is we will be having PowerPoints and the recording online with a link. So you can look up a lot of Gita's suggestions and obviously ask her questions at the end as well. And thank you very much, Gita. I think we're now moving on to Francine. Do you want to share your screen, Francine, and get going?
Can you see my screen there? Thank you, Jeremy.
We can, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, I will go very quickly. I think that we are almost out of time. So let me quickly just introduce, take a deep breath. Thank you, everyone, for having me today. I'm looking at economic sustainability, and I'm looking at it from a different point of view. I'm looking at it from an ideas point of view and a almost let's tear it down and build it up kind of view. Let's admit that certain things don't work and that we need change. So when we look at economic sustainability, I've been asked to look at employment, at home working, at on-site workshops, potential for food production and circular economy. Now we've looked at the first four there at the top already. And before we can look at circular economy, we really should talk about money. And we should talk about where the money is and where the money goes and who of us have money and who of us do not have money. And when we talk about money with regard to sustainability, we must talk about carbon, because carbon and natural resources is what we leverage alongside an oppressed workforce to really generate wealth, to generate profit. And where does that money go? And then we can look at circular economy versus linear economy and the rest of it. So let's start quickly and talk about carbon. This is the result of our carbon use. We extract fossil fuels from the earth and then we burn it. We use it to generate electricity, and we are a plague upon this planet, really, human beings at the moment, is we are completely changing the face of our planet. And this is happening quickly. I like to draw doodles. If we look at when the world was new, we had a lot of organic material in the oceans and trees, and these could not really decompose, so they fell down. The Earth's crust pressed up, and then more matter pressed down, and we created fossil fuels, which we then use for buildings. And this is 4 pictures from around the world. The bottom right is Johannesburg, but we're also looking at North America, Asia, and South America, Mexico. And this is commonly what is happening in the world today, is we are breathing air that is killing us. So regardless of your standing, the way we consume and the way we produce is really the problem that we are facing at the moment. And if we look at what the IPCC says, at the moment we are in 2022, which means that a child born 2 years ago, if they live to be 70 years old, then the heat will kill them and the air will. Talk, and you might ask, what does this have to do with buildings, and what does this have to do with human settlements? And the fact of the matter is, human settlements, they need more resources than they produce. Bangladesh is a country, and it needs far more than its country's ecological footprint to actually, it has to take from our stores. We have to constantly take from our stores. The same goes for the amount of wool we need. Most of you will already know this data. You would have come across it in other subjects. But at the moment, we are depleting the stores of our world, the carbon stores, and the average temperature is just going up. Now, if we look at per capita CO2 emissions, South Africa is actually in the red. We are above average. Now, per person, I think we have about 1 to 2 tons of carbon, and we are going through it. I think I'm on 8 carbon a year. And this is largely due to how we live. It's largely due to how our cities are formed and how human settlements function. So how do you take carbon out of the air? You plant trees. And I wish it was as simple as that, but it is almost as simple as that. If we bring nature and look at natural resources as regenerative powers, we can actually solve a lot of problems. So what does this have to do with buildings? If we look at buildings, 36% of the world's energy is used by buildings. 40% of the world's materials are used by buildings. 39% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions are associated with buildings. And 40% of landfill waste comes from construction and demolition. So this is, once again, the trash that we produce, the waste that we produce, and this is actually a resource. But if you look closely, this is mostly plastic, which is carbon. And there are 2 places that plastic goes. It becomes microplastics and goes into our bodies and causes us ill health, or we have to burn it and it enters the air that we breathe. So let's talk about money. Who wins with all of this? Where does the money go? And it's interesting because in 2024, the 85 richest people across the globe had the same amount of money as the bottom 35% of the world's population regarding wealth. So half the planet's people had the same wealth as 85 people. Now, in my first year architecture school, we were 85 people in the class. So that's astounding. And it's gotten worse. In 2023, the richest 1% bagged nearly twice as much wealth as the rest of the world put together over the past 2 years. So this is astounding. And if we look at this 1% versus the 99%, there's a few factors that come into play. And this is, I theorize, that it's a scarcity mentality. And we all suffer from it. We know that there's not enough to go around, and we all try and accumulate wealth. We try and take. And we have to take it from somewhere. So if we take it from natural resources, or we take it from the labor of somebody else, that 90% has to give, or else it doesn't work. So how do we reclaim back this abundance mentality that we should have? How do we restrict the give and bring it back? And that, in a nutshell, is the difference between a linear economy and a circular economy. A circular economy is vested in an abundance mentality, and a linear economy is vested in a scarcity mentality. So let's look at these two just briefly as well. This is research that I've done with one of my mentors, Prof. Almira Osman. In 2021, we wrote a paper together where we looked at the environmental and mental well-being of cities in Pretoria. And at the end of the day, we looked at a circular economy. Now, circular economy, according to Kate Raworth, argues that we must transform economic mindset away from the linear industrial system, which are degenerative and divisive and addicted to growth, towards economies that are regenerative and distributive and able to thrive beyond growth, such as indigenous thinking and circular economies with economic equilibrium. How do we achieve that? How do we look in ourselves, who of us are taking and who of us are giving? And how can we as architects create environments, propose developments, and work towards human settlements that stop this linear growth, that stops this perceptual growth and stops this linear economy in favor of a circular economy? So the paper that Prof. Almira and I wrote deals with the self, it deals with the abundance mentality and the scarcity mentality. And it deals with the apartheid city. We've looked at this last week, how we've segregated people based on race and how we've placed people away from each other. And I always think about me and myself and how can I change this? Now, obviously, from a personal point of view, I can consume less animals. 10,000 years ago, 95% of all vertebrate land animals, the weight of was wild animals. And today that's 1%. And then the animals we exploit. I stopped flying. I haven't taken an international flight in 10 years. But that's not enough because I constantly surrender my power. And everybody does, for opportunities to be economically active. And to be economically active, we consume consumer goods, which we actually also produce. And these consumer goods, they are responsible for the carbon emissions and the environmental degradation. And that leads to our mental health decline and capitalist power increase. So this cycle, this system, this economic sustainability system is what we're all, we're slaves to it. And how do we disrupt this? How do we change this? How do we go from a linear economy to a circular economy? And that, Prof. Almira's argument was, we need integrated human settlements. We need settlements that can accommodate for us as producers and consumers away from the capitalist linear system, where we have to plug into other systems in order to survive, where we take cost ownership of our production and our consumption. So there's other words for linear economies and circular economies. It's also called industrial thinking or indigenous thinking. And industrial thinking is resource, use, discard, and we become depleted. Whereas an indigenous thinking is resource use and reuse. And this holds the potential to replenish. But we cannot have this if we do not accommodate for it within human settlements. Now, linear economy is also a settler mentality, industrial thinking mentality, and industrial thinking mentality or a settler mentality really does require resource and labor to consume for profit. And this imperialism of conquer and oppress, that we need the indigenous thinking to combat that. And we need to fight. How do we reclaim our power? How do we provide human settlements where people are not conquered and oppressed? How do we provide human settlements that produce and consume to replenish? And of course, apartheid is a South African concept, but it's also happening in Palestine. It's also happening in Canada. And we also have the global adaptation apartheid, where the developing world can no longer or cannot afford to adapt at the rate that the developed world can because of profit, because we are small little batteries in a matrix that provide money for the rich. Now, if we look at Pretoria, which is my home, I've done some research with friends on the intersectionality of our city and who of us fit into Pretoria and who of us do not fit into Pretoria. And we looked at the formation of Pretoria. This is from your Dawn. And we saw that it has a beautiful natural typology. And then nestled within it is this city form, this grid with a center, nestled within the feminine, almost natural, is this masculine power on top of it. And we looked at our own personal intersectionality as well, and how we relate to this post-apartheid city. We looked at white, masculine, binary, colonial, linear, Afrikaner, heteronormative, and Protestant as the preferred human to live within the city, and queer, spiritual, black, feminine, non-conforming, indigenous, circular, and African as those that are perhaps not as welcome within the city. So if you look at your own intersectionality, where do you fit in? And if you look at the members of your group, where do they fit in? And how do you fill all the little spots together to bring an idea to life that might actually address some of the problems we face? And then, of course, this beautiful city of ours, with your satellite in the center. So to summarize, economic sustainability, we have macro issues, the climate emergency, and our fossil fuels, our cheap energy. We have loss of life, loss of property, loss of human settlements as a result. And we're not even starting to talk about the loss of nature. But this displacement, refugees and migrants from rural to urban migration, that is important parcel in addition to apartheid. That is the reason we have this housing problem. So how will your housing proposal be economically sustainable, that those who live there can produce and consume in a way that mitigates the climate emergency? How is that going to happen? So this little house, if we look at it, and we look at the time frame there at the top, the construction actually takes 10% of the carbon, the materials and the construction. But the operation, the heating, the cooling, that takes a further 80%. So we must look at passive design, we must look at the site, we must look at culture. And Prof. Jeremy has already touched on that. And then the end of life. Is this a multi-generational development? Will it allow for those people that are only born today, who will face a vastly different world from the one that we are facing? Will it allow for open building principles, demolition, and disassembly? And then the variables. I know the variables are overwhelming. And I look at single unit homes in my research and how knowledge management can improve them. And I'm looking at these existing variables and these emerging variables. And we all know the existing variables: cultural, natural, industrial, indigenous, visual tectonics, and technology tectonics. But how can we address climate resilience adaptation? How can we redress imperialism? How can we give economic and social fairness or foothold towards a circular economy? How can we have service provision systems intersection with a circular approach? How can we have amenity systems intersection with a circular approach? And how can we eventually have a development that has a regenerative potential? So these are all systems. These are all systems that you might decide to use or not use within your development. And in your decision tree, some of you will have more systems and some of you might have less or other systems. And that is fine. At the end of the day, the question is, how well have you resolved it? And how well have you presented the systems that you approach or propose to mitigate and to challenge and to address these issues that we have, this interlayered sustainability problem? So Aristotle said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But at the end of the day, our system's limitations is this planet. How will your development either contribute towards climate change or mitigate it? And what is your system boundaries? And that's it. I hope that I've done this very quickly, seeing as we're running out of time. Remember to join the CIB and join one of these task groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francine. I don't think we're running out of time at all. I think we're well in time. But what's also nice is we've got plenty of time for questions and discussions. So thank you very much for your presentation. I think everybody will have seen very different presentations. So there's a huge amount of ideas and approaches. I certainly have some questions, but I'm going to wait and just have a look and see who does have questions. I'll also open the chat in case anybody wants to write. I don't see anybody in the writing any questions in the chat room. I think please put up your hand and share your questions or comments. If some of the information has been controversial, which is intentional, so you know, you're also welcome to comment. Are there some questions? I've got a quick question for Gita. So, Gita, I think one in some of the work that I've done always has two things that run in parallel. When you're looking at kind of social infrastructure, you're looking at social housing, is you develop infrastructure, the buildings and workshops and all of those sorts of things, gardens, etc. But what you also need is you know, making sure that they're used well, they're designed and linked with the people that will operate them and manage them and make them sustainable. So this kind of whole idea of how do you develop really sustainable management and systems for social housing. I've seen many social housing projects where they're very dilapidated, very poorly managed, and there isn't the ownership of the buildings, and you know, there's leaks, there's sewage, the rubbish is overflowing. So one of the questions I have for you, because I think you've been thinking about it and looking at examples, is what works, how and how do you put together that the kind of social organizational structure of a successful sustainable human settlements for affordable housing. Now, obviously, if it's very expensive, you just, you know, you use a facilities manager. But if you want to make it work for the community and affordable, you know, what are the models? How do they work? Gita?
So, Jeremy, in that Vusinchuncha project, how we thought about it was firstly to understand how the finances could work. Because what happens in our urban systems is that cities cannot look after areas that don't pay their rates and taxes. So you get a level of neglect that occurs at the level of waste collection, fixing up roads and systems, etc. So you get a quality of infrastructure management and maintenance and of the environment that cannot sustain the level of demand from the number of people that are living in it. So by thinking carefully about what urban resources people actually own, in theory, and even that was a very interesting argument with the city, because the city thinks that they own the waste that's produced by people. And so, you know, they must collect the waste and then do whatever they do with it. We segmented that and we said, okay, if the people own their own waste and if they can recover 80% of the organic nutrients, can we create these beneficial agreements? So I think at the level of urban management, there's probably a few stages. How do we conceptualize the urban resources and the resources within that environment, and how can they be reframed in a useful fashion that serves the local people? Because they're not going to be able to get access to resources that they cannot access So how do they work with the existing resources? And we worked out in the end that people actually use their resources optimally anyway, where they are facilitated. So how do you facilitate that? So it's thinking about those resources and how we bring that into the design and planning systems, but how we also negotiate that. Secondly, how do we shift the behavior change around how people operate? And again, the notion of using the cell phone system. So there was a one pocket system where, and this has been used successfully in places like Curitiba and Medellin and various other places, where for good behavior of a particular sort, like you bring back your organic waste to the urban squares, you actually get a token on your phone, and that token allows you to do your washing for free, and your washing for free is being done by the water that's recycled on the site from the grey water, and is safe but is not potable, etc., etc. Now, all of that design systems thinking that we bring in is going to have to be managed, and we had a discussion with the new unit at UCT. And this project hasn't happened yet, and it may never see the light of day, but the conceptualization and thinking of it was very useful. We started this discussion with government and with the university to say, if we can begin to train local management agencies so that each precinct of, say, 500 to 1,000 people actually have a level of urban managers. What we ran the numbers, and we found that by virtue of the income coming from the solar farms and from the rooftop gardening, so on a 19-hectare site, we had something like 5 hectares worth of solar farm and 5 hectares worth of urban greening. That partial business ownership that the community has doesn't go directly to them, but it creates the fund that supports teams of about 8 to 12 urban managers that help to actually manage and maintain those environments. So we thought about an urban management model that could do that. Separately, I did some work in Canada many years ago around the social housing movement. And what they did at the level of the precinct or at the level of the building was to create a set of local bylaws. The local bylaws are part of governance that says these are the rules we agree to live by. This is how we deal with waste. This is how we deal with noise. This is how we deal with violence and abuse. And they're authorized people in the community, and everybody agrees to it, that for good behavior, there's certain rewards, and for a breakdown of those rules and agreements, people are authorized to take responsibility. And certainly at the level of women and vulnerable people, that worked very well. So it's about consciously recreating and intentionally recreating some of those social bylaws and working with them. So, and at the level of the city, then we ran many workshops where we brought all the different agencies together, and we said, okay, so you have one social worker for this area, you have one clinician for this area, etc., etc. What happens if you actually have a hub that is a service center where you can all work together around one roof? So instead of having 5 files on a family, you have one integrated file. And they loved the idea. Now, how do we move the city from operating the way it currently does to actually adopting that? I think these are the conversations we need to have. And, you know, in Cuba, they do this really well. They just go in there and they do it. We tend to have, we tend to be so over-bureaucratized that those simple systems that we can basically put into place are thwarted because we don't put our heads together. But the operational people we got into our workshops said, we'd love this. If you have the building there, we'll come and we'll make it work. So in theory, all of this was primed and positioned, and hopefully my lifetime it will happen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think lots of interesting ideas, useful ideas. I think just to kind of remind everybody, to a certain degree, what you're architects, but you also have a responsibility for how the architecture is used and how it's managed, and what are the social structures around it. And I think Gita's given some very nice ideas about how some of the kind of parallel systems that you might want to think about in order to get a really sustainable human settlement, housing, etc. Okay, questions? I'm sure there's some questions. Tutors, welcome anybody, or comments? This is very unusual.
I've got a question. Wait,
Okay.
there's a question here
Oh,
as well. Or there's a comment
Yeah,
here as well.
I see. Okay, Judith, Judith, where are you? I can't see on the screen. I think maybe just.
I'll quickly read it. I can see it. And Jeremy, it says, from Judith, I like the idea of sleeping small and living big. Can you comment on welcoming and inclusive versus exclusive and safe spaces?
Okay, I think this one will be for Gita. I don't know, did you hear that, Gita?
So
Yeah.
the way, I think safety and security are very key issues in our societies at every level, including informal settlements or low-income communities as well. So what's important is to be able to identify and make sure that people understand chosen or designated spaces that begin to provide the opportunity for interaction and building the social glue. Schools are some of those, meeting areas are some of those, and the agents who do this are some of those as well. So, in some of the projects that we've looked at, and we've actually looked at how we try and work with the idea of these designs as little citadels or neighborhoods that actually can be policed. So using the violence prevention and the environmental design principles, how do you work with the way in which certain things are placed in certain places? So larger units, maybe shared units, maybe units for the aged are placed in places where they actually automatically become the kind of community caretakers or the eyes of the community. And then it's a question of what the agreements are at the level that they interact. Some of the things we found very useful in looking at other projects and contexts is the idea of intergenerational centers, where a building, and that's what we've done in the heart of those neighborhoods, is the red buildings are actually buildings where literally you have a program of events and stuff that can go on in those communities. And we designed for World Cup 2010 a little soccer facility where literally they had programs that allowed different age groups and different interest groups to be able to use a small building and an AstroTurf sports field. So in the mornings, the mothers would come and they would do a bit of exercise and they would get a bit of inputs around obesity and health and nutrition. Then a little later, the ECD children would come and play. It was the only space that was not dusty and that they could actually roll around and play and do things. In the afternoons, the primary school kids came. In the evenings, the young men came. And on Fridays, the young men came, and that actually stopped them drinking. And then they had their matches on the weekend. So there are a number of those kind of spaces, but it's got to work with the program. So we've got to take a lot of care around our programs that work, that we support them and nurture them. And it's a real difficulty because these programs struggle for their funding. So can that funding potentially be generated at a local level? Do people pay a small amount, or do we look at crowdfunding or any other ways that can support those programs? So it's both the conceptualization and then making it work. So, I mean, in the work that I do, and also through my network of younger people I engage with through my children and various others, a whole bunch of sports greats. And what they do is that they have this vision where they want to come and invest in using sport, using art, using music. I mean, in Kosovo informal settlement, the mothers of those communities basically used the money they had to foster children. The foster money that they got, they ran soup kitchens. And they had these phenomenal programs of hip hop dancing and soccer in these narrow alleyways between the shacks. And a student from India came and stayed with me for 6 months and documented all of this. Now, that community was willing to create a living fence around a site that they were protecting so they could use it. And we then intervened on their behalf to secure the site for them to be able to use to create a community facility. Even without buildings, it provided something useful for them. That was a real battle with the city because they said they would have to go out to tender. That kind of nonsense we've got to stop. So I believe today, if you want to do this work, you have to continue to be an activist and stand up for those things which are actually a nonsense in our society and find ways of breaking through. We understand why those rules are there, but they thought the very communities that are actually just trying to find a bit of relief in the way in which they can live. So it's how we optimize the utilization of existing facilities, but how we also, so one of my dreams is to actually create a structure that doesn't cost very much, which is a fence, which becomes a living fence, and a structure that creates an internal space that you can meet in. And so when it rains, you can't, but for the rest of the time, you're windproof, especially in the Western Cape. That's really important. And you shade it and you harvest the grenadillas and the grapes off it, or whatever.
Thanks, Eric. Very nice idea. I can visualize
Absolutely.
this productive fence where people meet. I think one of the things Gita's talking about, which is quite important, is this idea of social cohesion. Is can you use social infrastructure? So can you use a building, or can you use the layout, or can you use activities to encourage people to meet, build trust, build networks, and so you have a much more efficient, you know, and a much more efficient society. Okay, I think we've got a question here. Do you want to ask a question? I think it's to Francine. I don't see it here, but if you unmute yourself and just ask a question. Can anyone see here?
I'll quickly
Okay, there we
attempt.
go.
Just curious, reframing urban resources. Do you think that implementing such measures would serve people's needs? Is that what architects should ideally focus on as advocates for people's social justice? Is it being implemented in Johannesburg or Pretoria? Urban resources, that's a very interesting question, because from my point of view, urban spaces where we go to generate money, where we go to, especially in Pretoria, we have very little urban spaces in Pretoria that people can enjoy. And the city is only accessed by people that work there and people that go there for economic activity and economic opportunities. So a very good urban resource that is underutilized, that runs right through the site, is the Opis River, which is a natural resource that people are not tapping into, that is an opportunity that isn't used at all. Another opportunity that is missed is a hybrid of access. There's an overwhelming amount of vehicular traffic and vehicular access, cars, personal cars, taxis, and buses that access the site, but pedestrian access is limited and unsafe. So definitely what Gita has spoken about, those Jane Jacobs principles, eyes on the street, and how to make a place safe and provide opportunities for people to make it safe would be important. But urban resources, I'm a bit lost. Perhaps Jeremy or Gita would have more ideas for urban resources that people can grab. Yeah, Jeremy, please.
I think it's a very important point, because if we think about sustainability, the most sustainable locations in cities are where there's density, where there's good access to public transport. Gita mentioned this, but good networks, there's water, electricity, access to schools, access to jobs. So what is really important is, the locational value is incredibly important. And one of the things that we've deliberately chosen the site is that it's fantastically located. You know, when you look at it, you might not think it's a brilliant site, but in terms of being able to provide for sustainable living and working patterns, it's got everything. It's close to a lot of the things that you need for everyday life. And I think one of the kind of social justice issues is that we put people that have the fewest resources the furthest away from these types of sites. You know, we put them in the kind of periphery, or right on the edge of cities, and instead we locate a good 6 meters squared for car parking spaces, which may never be used because people are worried about security. So if you think about the social justice of the spaces around that site, it's incredibly wasteful, it's incredibly unsustainable, because the value of land is not recognized in terms of sustainability. And the city and historic planning and designs over-allocated, spaces to cars, to car parking spaces, and instead put people, on the periphery. So there's quite an interesting research project and think something that you can do to think through the sustainability value of that site compared to any other site. And do you use that process of looking at this site really as a catalyst for rethinking inner cities? Bob talked a little bit about inner cities and how we make sure that the incredible value, sustainability value of inner cities really is accessed more equitably and used for housing. So that's one of the questions really around this competition. So thank you for raising it.
Can I add, Jeremy?
Go ahead.
So in my slides where I showed those ladders for people who are gardeners or domestic workers or whatever, and the idea that one can step up what they do over time, if we think about it, in most urban areas, the most arable land is often in those cities, Cape Town, Joburg, Pretoria, where there are huge gardens, private gardens, that are growing all sorts of weird and wonderful things. But if those were producing food, and you could call in a horticulturalist from this area, who is a food specialist and a recycling specialist, who's properly trained and accredited, who could come and convert your resource into fantastic organic food, which then they get a share of, and you also then have access to it. What could that begin to turn around in terms of the water cycle? So you're recycling water, you're recycling the organic waste, and you're actually generating a resource. We would be recovering about the 1 or 2% of arable land we have in this country that is sitting under cities, and put it to productive use and creating jobs. So that's how we thought about it. And that's why I drew that arrow that says, if you think about it, these people, their biggest resource is themselves and the skills they can provide to unlock the resources. And that's what we mean by regeneration. They unlock the resources within the wider environment in many, many multiple different ways.
I think just one last thing from my side as well, but those are obviously excellent question and excellent answers, is if a domestic worker who currently travels into the city, and that travel is 2 hours back and 2 hours forth, that 4 hours can be used on activities such as what Gita has mentioned, and thereby uplift this person from these chains of poverty. So it's just access to the city. It already makes a massive difference.
I think I like both of those points. And the interesting thing is, if you look at cities like London, where I've lived a few years, incredibly wealthy cities, but if you look at the way space is used, it's incredibly intensely used. So many neighborhoods will have a market, a food market, where people will sell fresh veg, apples, etc. But what you also find is, if you look at the railway embankments or little pieces of leftover land, what tends to happen is they get allocated for allotments. So you pay £5 a year for your license, and it may not be very big. It might be 20 square meters. but you can grow a huge amount of fresh vegetables on that space, and there's usually a source of water, and so you can live in a very small apartment. So the idea of Gita, sleeping small and living large, from your very small apartment or room with a bed in it, you can walk out to an allotment where you grow vegetables. You can go to all sorts of social activities. You can go to night classes. One of the things that you find in somewhere like London is that every day of the week, all the primary schools become available for evening classes, and you can learn pretty much anything you can think of, from programming through to psychology to pottery, and it's very much using your kind of highly valuable space incredibly intensely for the benefit of people, and the diversity, the fulfillment of people. Good. I think we may be reaching the end. So are there any last questions? I don't see any more on the meeting chat. Anybody else want to ask a question? Okay, I think we're then going to close. Francine, do you want to say anything before we close?
I would like to just extend a big thank you to Gita for joining us today. I think that was very, very valuable. Thank you so very much. And then good luck to all the students. Gita, we will obviously share with you as well what the students do. I think you'll find it very interesting. And then good luck, folks. Good luck. There's still a lot of time left. I know working in groups is sometimes tricky, but think of all the work hours capacity that you now have to really refine your projects. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Jeremy.
Okay,
bye everyone.
Thank you, Francine. Yeah. Okay, so I see there's some last questions. Actually, not questions, but people wanting to follow up with questions. I think, Gita, you'll be happy to be emailed. Are you? I think, obviously, you're very busy, but I think if you've got this particular questions, follow up through us or Francine, and we'll try and get some answers. There's also, Francine has just left her email address, but all the material also will be available in the same folder that the other material has been. So thank you very much, everybody. And Gita, I think, thank you very much from your side. It's been fantastic to kind of share some of your thinking and some of the projects. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for inviting me. Good luck, everyone.
2 weeks time, same place, same computer. Good. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.